Welcome back, my friend. Before tonight's story begins, take a quiet moment for yourself. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let tonight's quiet journey begin. I thought the deepest part of the ocean would be dark, but I didn't expect it to feel like this. Not empty, not silent, but unchanged. The deeper we went, the less anything seemed to happen, until eventually we realized something strange. It wasn't that things had stopped changing. It was that nothing here had ever changed at all. So tonight, we're not exploring movement, not waves, not life as we know it. We're going somewhere quieter than that. A place where time doesn't seem to leave any trace at all. The place where nothing moves. I didn't expect the ocean floor to feel like this. Not empty, not lifeless, not abandoned, but unmoving. Not the kind of stillness you notice, not the kind that feels calm. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that makes you question whether anything had ever moved here at all. The descent had already taken longer than expected, not because the vessel slowed, but because time stopped behaving the way it normally does. At first, there had been signs of change. Light fading, pressure increasing, the sense of depth becoming more real. But those changes didn't last. Eventually, everything stopped changing, and that was when it began. The ocean floor didn't appear. It didn't reveal itself. It didn't rise to meet us. It was simply there, not as a surface, not as a landscape, but as a presence. Something so stable, so unchanged, that it didn't feel like part of a world that evolves. It felt permanent. The first time I saw it, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. There were no clear shapes, no shadows, no edges that could be followed. Only a faint difference between the darkness above and the darkness below. A line that wasn't really a line, a boundary that didn't behave like one. And yet, once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. The floor of the ocean wasn't something you discovered. It was something that slowly became undeniable. And the longer you looked, the more unsettling it became, because nothing about it suggested movement. No drifting particles, no shifting sediment, no signs of disturbance. It didn't look like something that had settled. It looked like something that had always been that way, as if time had stopped before it ever reached this place. The vessel hovered, or at least that's what it felt like. There was no sense of landing, no impact, no moment of arrival, only the quiet realization that we were no longer descending. And yet, nothing felt like we had arrived anywhere. I remember trying to focus on a single point, to follow something, to confirm that the environment was real, but there was nothing to follow, no movement to track, no change to observe, only stillness, and not the comforting kind. The kind that lingers, the kind that makes you aware that nothing here is going to change, no matter how long you stay. That was when the thought first appeared. Not loud, not clear, but persistent. What if this place doesn't change at all? Not slowly, not over time, not even in ways too small to notice. What if this is exactly how it has always been? And that thought didn't go away, because the longer we remained, the more it began to feel true. The ocean floor didn't react to our presence. It didn't shift. It didn't respond. It didn't even seem to acknowledge that anything had entered it. We weren't disturbing it. We were irrelevant to it. That was the unsettling part, because everything else in the world changes. Wind moves, water flows, light shifts. But here, none of that existed. This wasn't a place where things slowed down. This was a place where change never began. And the deeper you stayed within it, the harder it became to remember what movement even felt like. Because after a while, even your thoughts began to match it. Slower, quieter, less willing to move forward. As if the environment itself was teaching you something or removing something. I remember sitting there, looking at a surface that never moved and realizing this was not just the bottom of the ocean. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong to the same rules as everything above it. And the longer you stayed, the more it felt like it never would. Where time leaves no trace. At first, I thought it was just still, just quiet, just another part of the ocean that had settled into rest. But the longer I remained there, the more something began to feel wrong. Not dangerous, not threatening, but absent. There was no sign that anything had ever happened here. Not recently, not long ago, not at all. I remember scanning the surface carefully, not looking for anything specific, just searching for evidence, a disturbance, a mark, a shift, anything that suggested time had passed through this place. But there was nothing, no trails, no layering, no signs of movement that had come and gone. Even the smallest changes were missing. And that was when I understood. This wasn't just stillness. This was something deeper. This was a place where time didn't leave traces. The idea settled slowly, not as a realization, but as something that refused to disappear. Because normally, even in the quietest places, time leaves something behind. Dust gathers, surfaces shift, particles move, even when nothing else does. But here, nothing had accumulated, nothing had changed, nothing had even attempted to change. It wasn't that things stopped moving, it felt like movement had never been part of this place at all. I remember focusing on a single point, holding my attention there, waiting, expecting something, anything to shift, but it didn't. Not slightly, not gradually, not even in a way too small to see. And the longer I waited, the more unsettling that became. Because waiting usually reveals something. Even silence changes over time. Even stillness breathes in its own way. But this didn't. It held perfectly, as if it had been frozen before anything had the chance to begin. The thought came again, stronger this time. What if nothing has ever happened here? Not just recently, not just within human time, but ever. I tried to dismiss it. The ocean is vast. There are processes we don't understand, movements too slow to detect. But even that explanation required time. And here, there was no evidence that time had ever touched this place. The vessel hovered, or drifted, or remained. It was impossible to tell, because without change, movement becomes meaningless. I remember glancing at the instruments. Numbers continued to shift, depth, pressure, time. But those numbers felt disconnected. They belonged to the vessel, not to the place around us. The environment itself did not reflect any of it. It didn't acknowledge the passing of time. It didn't react to movement. It simply existed, unchanged. And that was when the tension deepened. Not fear, not panic, but a quiet discomfort. that stayed just beneath awareness. Because if this place does not change, then what happens if you stay here long enough? The question didn't feel hypothetical. It felt relevant, like something that applied to us already. I remember noticing how my thoughts had slowed, not intentionally, not because I was trying to relax, but because there was nothing for them to move toward. No progression, no sequence, only repetition. The same observation, the same stillness, the same unchanging surface. And slowly, the mind begins to mirror what surrounds it. It stops expecting change, stops looking for difference, stops moving forward. And just like that, you begin to understand something you weren't meant to feel. What it is like to exist in a place where nothing evolves, where nothing develops, where nothing becomes something else. I remember sitting there, watching a surface that never shifted and realizing this was not a moment in time. This was something outside of it, something that did not belong to before or after, only always. And once that thought settles, it becomes very difficult to let it go, because the longer you stay, the more it begins to feel true. Not as an idea, but as a condition. The ocean floor did not just resist change, it existed without it. And that was when I began to understand why nothing here feels like it's waiting, because waiting implies something will happen, and here nothing ever does. The weight of something that never ends. It didn't happen all at once. There was no moment where everything suddenly felt different, just a gradual shift, so subtle that at first I almost didn't notice it. The stillness wasn't just around us anymore. It was pressing, not physically, not in a way you could measure, but in a way that made everything feel heavier. I remember adjusting my position slightly, not because I needed to, but just to confirm that movement was still possible. It was, but it didn't feel natural. It felt unnecessary, as if movement itself had no place here. And that was when I began to understand something else. This place didn't just lack change, it resisted it, not actively, not violently, but completely. The ocean floor didn't shift because nothing here had any reason to. And slowly, that logic began to extend beyond the environment. It began to reach inward. Thoughts became shorter, not because they were incomplete, but because they had nowhere to go. Ideas didn't develop, they didn't connect. They simply appeared and then remained unmoving, just like everything else. I remember trying to recall something from earlier, a conversation, a moment from the surface, but it felt distant, not in time, but in structure, because up there, things flow. One moment leads to another. One thought becomes the next. But here, there was no sense of progression, only presence. And that presence was becoming difficult to ignore. It wasn't empty. That was the strange part. It felt full, not with objects, not with movement, but with something else, something that didn't need to change to exist. The longer I stayed, the more that presence became noticeable, not visible, not defined, but undeniable, like a weight that had always been there, a kind of pressure that didn't come from above, but from everywhere. At first, I thought it was just the depth, the natural pressure of the ocean, but that wasn't it. This was different because physical pressure pushes. This didn't. It held completely, without fluctuation, without variation, as if it had never known anything else. And slowly, you begin to feel something unexpected. Not fear, not panic, but a quiet realization that there is no escape from something that never changes, because escape requires movement, and movement requires difference. But here, there was none. I remember looking again at the ocean floor, trying to find something to focus on, something that could anchor my attention, but there was nothing to hold on to. No feature, no variation, no detail that stood out from the rest. Everything was equally unchanged, and that was when the weight became clearer, not because it increased, but because I finally understood it. This place doesn't end, not in the way landscapes end, not in the way environments shift or transition. There is no edge, no boundary, only continuation, endless, unbroken, unchanging continuation. And once you realize that, something inside you begins to respond, because the mind expects limits. It expects things to stop, to shift, to become something else. But when none of that happens, it begins to slow, not gently, but inevitably, like something being pulled into alignment with its surroundings. I remember sitting there, trying to think forward, trying to imagine the next moment, but there was nothing different to imagine, no change to anticipate, only more of the same. And that is when time begins to lose meaning, not because it disappears, but because it stops doing anything. Seconds pass, minutes pass, but nothing reflects it. Nothing confirms it. Nothing changes because of it. And slowly, time becomes something abstract, detached, irrelevant. Because if nothing changes, then what does time actually do? The thought didn't feel philosophical. It felt practical, like a question that had an answer, but no way to reach it. I remember noticing my breathing. It had slowed. Not intentionally, but because there was no urgency, no signal that anything needed to happen. And in that stillness, another realization began to form. This place does not wait, because waiting implies an outcome. But here, there is no outcome, only continuation. And that continuation does not acknowledge you. It does not include you. It does not require you. It simply continues. And the longer you stay within it, the more it begins to feel like you are the one thing here that doesn't belong. Not because you are unwelcome, but because you are temporary. And this place is not. I remember looking at the ocean floor and realizing this was not just something that had lasted a long time. This was something that did not experience time at all. And once that idea settles, the weight changes, because it's no longer about pressure. It's about scale, a scale so vast, so unmoving that everything else begins to feel fragile, temporary, almost unreal. And that is when the silence deepens, not around you, but inside you. Because once you understand what it means for something to never change, you begin to feel how much everything else does. And in that contrast, something shifts, not in the environment, but in you. When you realize it was always like this, at first, it feels like something has changed, like you've entered a place where the rules are different, where time behaves differently, where movement doesn't exist, where nothing responds the way it should. But that idea doesn't last, because slowly another thought begins to replace it. Not suddenly, not clearly, but steadily. What if nothing here has changed at all? What if this isn't a place that became still, but a place that never moved to begin with? The shift is subtle, but once it happens, everything feels different. Because before, You assume there was a before, a time when things were active, a moment when something happened, a point where change once existed. But here, there is no evidence of that, no trace of transition, no sign of anything becoming something else. And that absence begins to feel meaningful. I remember looking again at the ocean floor, not searching anymore, not expecting anything, just observing. And that's when it became clear. This isn't a surface that settled. This isn't a landscape that formed. This is something that simply is and always has been. There was no beginning visible here, no process you could follow backward, no origin you could imagine, because origins require change, and here there is none. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded, like something slowly aligning with a truth that had always been present. This place was never different. It never shifted into stillness. It never slowed down. It never needed to, because it was always like this. And once that idea settles, something inside you reacts, not emotionally, not dramatically, but deeply. Because if something has always been this way, then it does not belong to time. It does not exist within it. It exists outside of it, and that changes how you see everything else. I remember trying to imagine this place millions of years ago, trying to picture it in a different state, but nothing came to mind. Not because I lacked imagination, but because there was no reference for change. Every version of it felt identical, and that was the unsettling part, because most things carry a sense of history. Even if you don't know what happened, you feel that something did. But here, there was no history to feel, no past to sense, only presence. And that presence was complete. It didn't need time. It didn't need development. It didn't need to become anything else. It was already everything it would ever be. I remember becoming aware of my own thoughts again, how they still moved, still shifted, still tried to progress. And for the first time, that movement felt out of place, like something unnecessary, like something temporary. Because compared to this, everything that changes begins to feel unstable, fragile, almost unfinished. The ocean floor wasn't evolving. It wasn't becoming. It wasn't even continuing. It was simply being in the most complete sense. And that completeness does something strange to the mind, because the mind expects direction. It expects movement. It expects a path from one moment to the next. But when none of that exists, it begins to slow, not because it wants to, but because it has nothing to follow. I remember sitting there, no longer trying to understand, no longer trying to analyze, just present. And in that presence, something became undeniable. This place does not recognize time. It does not measure it. It does not reflect it. It does not even contain it. And because of that, it cannot change. Not slowly, not suddenly, not at all. And once you understand that, you begin to realize something else. You are the only thing here that will change. Your thoughts will shift. Your body will move. Your time will pass. But this place will remain exactly as it is, unmoved, unaffected, unaware. And that realization creates a quiet distance, not between you and the environment, but between you and everything you once understood about time. Because time, as you know it, only exists where change can be observed. And here, there is nothing to observe, only something to experience, something constant, something complete, something that does not move, even when everything else does. I remember one final thought before we began to move again, not a question, not a conclusion, just a quiet recognition. This is not the bottom of the ocean. This is something deeper, not in distance, but in nature, a place where change never arrived, a place where time never began, a place that does not wait because it does not need to. And as we slowly, almost reluctantly, began to rise away from it, I realized something that stayed with me long after. We hadn't discovered this place. We had only reached a depth where it became impossible not to notice it. The first sign of life. At first, I thought there was nothing here, not just no movement, no life, because life, as we understand it, requires change. It grows, it adapts, it responds, it moves towards something. But here, there was none of that, only stillness. And yet, the first sign did not appear as movement. It appeared as hesitation, something in the darkness that did not belong to the uniform stillness around it. Not because it moved, but because it didn't match. I remember staring at it longer than necessary, not trying to identify it, just trying to confirm that it was real, because in a place where nothing changes, even the smallest difference feels impossible. At first, it looked like a shadow, a faint irregularity, something slightly raised from the otherwise flat expanse. But then it shifted, not quickly, not clearly, just enough to break the illusion. And in that moment, something became undeniable. There is life here. But the realization didn't bring comfort. It brought something else. Because this life did not behave like life. It didn't explore. It didn't react. It didn't seem aware of anything beyond itself. It simply existed in the same way the ocean floor existed, unchanging, unaffected, complete. I remember waiting for it to move again, to confirm that it was alive, but it didn't, not for a long time. And that was when the question began to form. Is it alive, or is it just present? The distinction felt important because life implies process, growth, decay, change. But here, none of that was visible. There was no sign that this creature had ever been anything else, or that it would ever become something different. It did not seem to be in a state of becoming, only being. And that made it feel closer to the ocean floor itself than to anything I had ever recognized as life. The more I observed, the more I noticed something unsettling. It wasn't alone. There were others, not many, not clustered, just scattered, each one separated by distance, each one existing in the same way, still unchanging, unaware, not interacting, not competing, not even acknowledging one another. They were not part of a system. They were not part of a cycle. They were not part of anything. And yet they existed. And that existence did not seem temporary. It didn't feel like something that would end or something that had begun. It felt continuous. The thought came quietly. What if this is what life looks like when it doesn't need to change? Not because it has adapted, but because nothing around it requires adaptation. No predators, no competition, no shifting environment, only permanence. And in that permanence, life loses its urgency. It no longer needs to move. It no longer needs to become. It only needs to remain. I remember realizing that I could not tell how old any of them were, not because they were hidden, but because there was nothing about them that suggested age. No signs of growth, no signs of decay, no indication that time had passed through them at all. And that was when the tension deepened again, because if life exists here without visible change, then what does time mean for something that does not evolve? The question stayed with me, because the more I observed, the more it became clear these creatures were not surviving. They were not adapting. They were not progressing. They were simply continuing in a way that did not depend on time. And once you begin to see that, it becomes difficult to look at life the same way again. Life without urgency. At first, I kept waiting for something to happen, not something dramatic, just a reaction, a movement that made sense, because life, as we understand it, is always moving towards something. Food, safety, light. There is always a reason. Even the smallest organisms respond. They adjust, they react, they try in ways we barely notice. But here, there was none of that. The creatures did not hunt. They did not search. They did not seem to notice that anything existed beyond themselves. Even the presence of the vessel changed nothing. No shift, no hesitation, no awareness. At first, I thought maybe they were simply too slow, that their movements existed on a scale we couldn't perceive. But even that explanation felt incomplete, because slowness still implies direction. It still implies intent. And here, there was no sign of either. I remember focusing on one of them, waiting again, not for movement, but for purpose. Something that suggested it needed anything at all. But nothing came. It did not reach. It did not withdraw. It did not even maintain itself in a way that felt active. It simply remained. And that was when the thought began to form. What if life here does not experience urgency? Not reduced urgency, not slower urgency, but none at all. Because urgency requires change. It requires something to happen, or something to be avoided. It requires a future that is different from the present. But here, the present does not change. And if nothing changes, then nothing needs to be done. The idea settled quietly. And once it did, everything else began to align with it. There were no signs of competition, no creatures approaching one another, no attempts to occupy space. They did not interact, not because they couldn't, but because there was nothing to gain, nothing to lose, nothing to become. I remember scanning the area again, looking for patterns, looking for relationships, but there were none. Each creature existed as if it were alone, even when others were nearby, not isolated, but independent in a way that did not require awareness. And that independence felt complete, not defensive, not adaptive, just sufficient. The longer I observed, the more something began to feel unfamiliar, not in the environment, but in my expectations, because I kept waiting for something that belonged to a different world, a world where life is driven, where survival requires effort, where existence is something you maintain through constant interaction. But here, existence did not require effort. It did not require action. It did not even require attention. Life continued without doing anything. And that was the unsettling part. Because if life can exist like this, then what part of life is actually necessary? I remember noticing how long we had been there, or at least how long I thought we had been there. But time didn't feel measurable anymore, because nothing marked its passing. No behavior changed, no patterns emerged, no progression occurred. Everything remained exactly as it was. And within that stillness, another realization began to form. These creatures are not waiting. They are not preparing. They are not anticipating, because there is nothing ahead of them that is different from where they are now. There is no next, only continuation. And when there is no next, urgency disappears completely. I remember feeling something shift inside me again, a subtle discomfort, because urgency is something we rely on. It gives structure, it gives direction, it creates movement. But here, there was none. And without it, everything began to feel suspended, not paused, but complete, as if nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be removed, nothing needed to happen. The creatures reflected that perfectly. They were not incomplete. They were not lacking anything. They were exactly what they needed to be. And that state did not require change. I remember trying one last time to find a sign of intention, a movement, a response, anything that suggested they were aware of their own existence. But there was nothing. Not because they were unaware, but because awareness did not require expression here. It did not need to lead anywhere. It did not need to do anything. It simply existed, just like everything else. And that was when the final thought settled. Life here does not try to survive because it does not need to. And once you understand that, you begin to question something much deeper, not about them, but about everything above. A world without death as we know it. At some point, the question changed. It was no longer about whether these creatures were alive. It became something else, something quieter, harder to define. What does it mean to stop existing here? The thought didn't come from fear. There was nothing threatening in the environment, nothing chasing, nothing attacking, nothing that suggested danger. And yet, something felt incomplete, because life, as we understand it, is always paired with something else, an ending, a limit, a moment where it stops. But here, there was no sign of that. I remember watching one of the creatures for a long time, long enough that in any other place, you would expect something to happen, a change, a shift, at the very least, a subtle sign of aging. But there was nothing. It did not weaken. It did not grow. It did not change in any visible way. And that was when the question deepened. If it does not change, then how would it ever end? The idea lingered, because death, as we understand it, requires transition, a movement from one state to another, a process. But here, there was no process, only continuation. I remember scanning the ocean floor again, looking for something different this time. Not movement, not life, but absence. A sign that something had been there and was no longer. But there was nothing, no remain, no disruption, no indication that anything had ever stopped existing. And that absence felt heavier than anything else, because in every other place, death leaves something behind, a trace, a mark. Even if it disappears over time, it exists briefly. But here, there was no evidence that anything had ever ended at all. The thought formed slowly. What if death does not exist here the way we understand it? Not because life is preserved, but because nothing transitions, nothing becomes something else, nothing leaves. It simply remains. The creatures did not look alive in the way I recognized, but they didn't look like they would die either. They did not appear fragile. They did not appear temporary. They appeared stable in the same way the ocean floor was stable, as if they belonged to the same condition, not living on the surface, but existing with it. unchanging. I remember focusing on a darker patch nearby, something that looked slightly different, not moving, not reacting, just present. For a moment, I thought it might be something that had ended, something that had once been alive. But the longer I looked, the less certain that became, because there was no difference, no boundary between what was alive and what was not. Everything shared the same quality: stillness, continuity, presence. And in that uniformity, the distinction began to fade, not disappear, but lose its meaning. I remember feeling something shift again, a quiet discomfort, because if you cannot tell when something ends, then what does ending actually mean? The idea wasn't abstract anymore. It felt immediate, because in this place, there was no moment you could point to and say, it changed. And without change, there is no event, no transition, no clear beginning or end, only existence, unbroken. I remember thinking about time again, how it usually moves forward, how it creates distance between moments, how it allows things to begin and eventually to stop. But here, time did not seem to create anything. It did not produce difference. It did not separate one state from another. And because of that, it could not define an ending. The creatures reflected that perfectly. They did not appear temporary, but they also did not appear permanent. They simply did not appear to change. And in that absence of change, the concept of death began to dissolve, not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly, like something that no longer applied. I remember one final thought as I continued to observe, not a conclusion, just a realization. If nothing here changes, then nothing here truly ends. And if nothing ends, then everything is already complete. Not because it reached completion, but because it never left it. And once that idea settles, something becomes very difficult to ignore. This is not a place where life continues. This is a place where life never needed to begin or end at all. When life becomes indistinguishable from the world, at some point, I stopped trying to separate them, the creatures and the ocean floor, not because I couldn't see them, but because the difference no longer felt meaningful. At first, there had been a clear distinction. Something was alive, something was not. Something existed as a being, something existed as a place. But that clarity began to fade, not suddenly, not in a way that felt dramatic, just gradually, as if the idea itself was losing its structure. I remember looking across the ocean floor again, not searching this time, just observing. And what I saw no longer felt like a landscape with life inside it. It felt like a single condition, continuous, unbroken. The creatures did not stand out anymore. They did not interrupt the surface. They did not exist against it. They existed with it in the same way, with the same stillness, with the same absence of change, with the same sense of completion. And that was when the realization settled. They are not living on the ocean floor. They are part of it, not physically, but fundamentally in the way they exist. I remember focusing again on one of them, trying to isolate it, to see it as something separate. But the longer I looked, the harder that became, because nothing about it resisted the environment. It did not move against it. It did not change within it. It did not define itself apart from it. It simply matched it completely. And that was when the boundary disappeared, not visually, but conceptually. There was no longer a clear line between what is alive and what is not, because both shared the same condition: stillness, continuity, presence. I remember trying to recall how life normally behaves, how it pushes, how it responds, how it defines itself through interaction. But none of that applied here. There was no interaction, no response, no need to define anything, because everything already existed in a state that required nothing more. And in that state, life becomes difficult to recognize, not because it disappears, but because it stops behaving in ways we expect. It no longer signals itself. It no longer distinguishes itself. It no longer needs to. The creatures were not hidden. They were visible, but they were not separate. And that made them feel different, not unfamiliar, but beyond categorization. I remember feeling something shift again, not confusion, but acceptance, because once you understand the condition of this place, the distinction no longer matters. Life does not need to stand apart to exist. It does not need to act to continue. It does not need to change to be real. It simply needs to be. And here, that is enough. The ocean floor does not change. The creatures do not change. And because of that, they do not conflict. They do not compete. They do not disrupt one another. They exist as a single continuous state. And within that state, there is no hierarchy, no dominance, no struggle, only presence. I remember looking outward as far as the darkness allowed, trying to find an edge, a boundary, a point where this condition would end, but there was none, because this is not a region, it is a way of existing. And once you enter it, everything begins to align with it, even you. Your thoughts slow, your expectations fade, your need for change begins to loosen. And in that quiet shift, you begin to understand something that cannot be explained quickly. This is not a place where life exists. This is a place where existence no longer needs to be defined as life, because the difference no longer serves a purpose. I remember one final realization before we began to leave. Not something I thought, something I felt. There is no separation here, not between life and the world, not between presence and absence, not between beginning and end, only one continuous state that does not change because it does not need to. And once you experience that, it becomes very difficult to return to a world where everything depends on change. The absence of being observed. At first, it felt peaceful, not the kind of peace you choose, but the kind that happens when nothing reacts to you. No sound, no movement, no indication that anything has noticed your presence. In most places, you are never truly alone. Even in silence, there is always something responding. The wind shifts, the water moves, small changes that acknowledge you exist. But here, there was none of that. The ocean floor did not respond. The creatures did not react. Nothing adjusted because we were there. And at first, that felt calming because it meant there was no danger, no threat, nothing watching, nothing waiting, only stillness. But that feeling didn't last, because after a while, something began to feel different. Not in the environment, in the absence of it. I remember becoming aware of something missing, not physically, but conceptually. The sense of being observed, not by something specific, but by anything at all. Because in most environments, even when you are alone, you still feel part of a system, a world that registers your presence. But here, there was no system, no response, no acknowledgement. It wasn't that nothing was watching, it was that nothing had the capacity to watch. And that realization began to shift something inside me, because being unobserved is not the same as being alone. Being alone still implies that something could notice you if it were there, but this was different. This was a place where observation itself did not exist. The creatures did not look, they did not orient, they did not track movement. They simply existed without direction, without awareness that needed expression, and the environment did not reflect anything. No light change, no motion, no subtle indication that anything had entered it. We were not hidden, we were not ignored, we were simply irrelevant, and that was when the tension began. Not fear, but something quieter. Because without observation, your presence loses definition. Normally, you understand where you are because the world reacts to you. You move, something shifts. You exist, something reflects it. But here, nothing confirmed anything. I remember adjusting slightly again, a small movement, just to feel something change. But nothing did. Not around me, not beyond me, only the movement itself. And then nothing. It was as if the movement had no consequence, no impact, no continuation. And that was when the question formed. If nothing here observes, then what defines your existence? In this place, the thought lingered. Because without observation, there is no feedback, no confirmation, no sense of being part of anything, only presence, unacknowledged. I remember looking outward again, trying to feel connected to something, anything, but the darkness remained unchanged. The ocean floor remained still. The creatures remained indifferent, and slowly the absence became heavier, not because something was missing, but because it had never been there at all. This is not a place where you are unseen. This is a place where being seen is not part of reality. And once you understand that, the silence changes. It is no longer peaceful. It becomes complete in a way that leaves no space for you to belong to it. When awareness has nowhere to go. At first, I didn't notice the shift because everything still felt normal. I was aware. I could see. I could think. I could observe. Nothing had been taken away, and yet something wasn't working the way it should. I remember focusing on the ocean floor again, not because I expected anything new, but because that's what awareness does. It looks, it follows, it moves from one point to another. But here, there was nowhere for it to go. No variation, no detail that stood out, no movement to track, only the same unchanging surface. And after a while, the act of observing itself began to feel incomplete, not impossible, just unfinished, because awareness usually leads somewhere. You notice something, you follow it, you understand it, or move on. But here, there was no next, no direction, no progression, and slowly, awareness began to circle back on itself. I remember noticing how long I had been looking at the same point, not because I was trying to, but because nothing pulled my attention away. And when nothing pulls you forward, you begin to stay. And when you stay long enough, you begin to feel something else, a kind of quiet pressure inside your own thoughts. Not external, not physical, but something that builds when awareness has nowhere to go. I tried shifting my focus, looking slightly to the side, then further out, then upward, but everything was the same, not similar, identical in condition. And that was when the pattern became clear. There is nothing here for awareness to follow, nothing to explore, nothing to interpret, nothing to anticipate. And without those things, awareness begins to change. It doesn't expand, it contracts, not suddenly, but gradually, as if it is folding inward, searching for something to engage with. I remember becoming aware of my own thoughts again, not the content, the movement, or rather the lack of it, because thoughts usually flow. One leads to another. They connect, they build, but here they began to stall, not stop, just repeat the same observations, the same realization, circling without progressing. And that repetition began to feel noticeable, not frustrating, but limiting, because without new input, the mind cannot move forward. It can only revisit what it already knows. And in this place, there is nothing new, nothing different, nothing to break the cycle. I remember trying to think of something else, something unrelated, a memory, a place, anything that belonged to a world where things change. But even that felt distant, not because I couldn't remember, but because those memories required movement. They required sequence. And here, sequence did not exist. Everything was present at once, without order, without progression. And that made it difficult to think in the way I was used to, because thinking depends on movement. It moves from one idea to the next. But when there is no sense of next, thoughts begin to lose direction. They don't disappear. They simply stop going anywhere. And in that stillness, awareness begins to feel heavier, not because it increases, but because it has nowhere to release itself. No object, no change, no interaction, only itself, reflecting back again and again and again. I remember realizing something subtle. I was no longer observing the environment. I was observing my own attempt to observe it. And that shift was difficult to ignore, because it meant the environment had stopped offering anything, and awareness had turned inward, not by choice, but by necessity. And when awareness turns inward without variation, it begins to repeat, not thoughts, structure, the same pattern, the same loops, without progression, without resolution. And that is when the tension deepens, not because something is happening, but because nothing is changing. And without change, awareness begins to feel trapped, not physically, not emotionally, but structurally, because it cannot move forward and it cannot stop. It can only remain, just like everything else here. And that realization settles slowly, not as fear, but as something quieter, something more difficult to describe. Because once awareness has nowhere to go, you begin to understand something unexpected. This place does not just lack movement, it absorbs it, not by force, but by absence. And in that absence, everything that depends on movement begins to slow, even you. When you stop expecting change, at some point, something inside you gives up, not in a dramatic way, not in a way you would notice immediately, just quietly, like a habit that no longer continues. At first, you are still waiting for something to shift, waiting for something to appear. Even if you don't know what it is, there is still an expectation, because expectation is automatic. It belongs to the way we exist. We expect things to change. We expect moments to lead somewhere. We expect time to do something. But here, time does nothing. And slowly, that expectation begins to weaken. Not because you decide to let it go, but because it is no longer supported. There is no evidence that anything will change. No pattern suggesting that something is about to happen. No signal that anything is different from what it was before. only the same stillness, repeated without variation. I remember the moment it became noticeable, not when something happened, but when something stopped. I stopped waiting, not intentionally, not as a decision. It simply didn't occur anymore. The mind no longer reached forward. It no longer looked ahead. It no longer searched for what comes next, because there was no next. And once that expectation disappears, something else takes its place. A kind of quiet acceptance, not peaceful, not comforting, just accurate. This is how it is, and this is how it will remain. I remember looking at the ocean floor again, but it didn't feel like observation anymore. It felt like recognition, not of something new, but of something that had always been there, something that didn't require attention to exist, something that didn't change whether you noticed it or not. And in that recognition, awareness changes again, because awareness usually depends on expectation. It moves because it anticipates, it follows because it assumes something will happen. But when expectation disappears, awareness slows, not because it has less energy, but because it has no direction. I remember noticing how still everything felt, not just the environment. My thoughts, they no longer tried to move forward. They no longer tried to connect. They simply appeared and remained without urgency, without purpose, without the need to go anywhere. And that state was unfamiliar, because thinking, as we know it, is always moving. It progresses, it builds, it leads somewhere. But here, there was nowhere to lead. And so, thinking changed. It became present completely, without extension, without continuation. And that presence began to feel heavier than movement ever did. Not overwhelming, just complete, as if nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be resolved, nothing needed to be understood. Everything simply was. I remember realizing something subtle. I was no longer asking questions, not because I had answers, but because questions require expectation. They require the possibility of change. They assume something can be different. But here, nothing is different. Nothing becomes different. Nothing will be different. And without that possibility, questions lose their structure. They no longer lead anywhere. They simply fade. And when questions fade, something else disappears with them. Curiosity. Not completely, but its direction, because curiosity depends on discovery. It moves toward something unknown. But here, there is nothing unknown, not because everything is understood, but because nothing changes. There is no process to follow, no pattern to uncover, no transition to observe, only a condition that remains the same. And within that condition, curiosity has nowhere to go. I remember sitting there, aware of everything, and yet not reaching for anything, not expecting anything, not anticipating anything. And in that stillness, a final shift occurred, not in the environment, not in the creatures, but in perception itself. Because once you stop expecting change, you stop measuring time, not consciously, but naturally. Time no longer feels like movement. It no longer feels like progression. It becomes irrelevant, because if nothing changes, then nothing marks its passing. And without markers, time becomes indistinguishable from stillness. I remember trying to feel how long we had been there, but there was no way to tell. No difference between moments, no separation between before and now, only the same presence, extending without variation. And that was when the realization settled fully. This place does not resist change. It does not prevent it. It simply exists without it. And once you are within it, you begin to do the same, not because you choose to, but because there is nothing else to do. And in that state, something very quiet becomes clear. Change is not missing here. It was never part of this place to begin with. And once you stop expecting it, everything begins to feel exactly as it is. Complete, unmoving, and final in a way that does not end. When you realize you were the only thing that changed, it doesn't happen as a thought. It happens as a recognition, something you don't arrive at, but something you notice has already happened. At first, everything here felt unfamiliar, strange, difficult to understand. You tried to interpret it, tried to compare it to the world you knew. You looked for patterns, for movement, for anything that could explain what this place was. But none of that worked, because nothing here responded to that kind of thinking. And slowly, without realizing it, you began to adjust, not consciously, not intentionally, just gradually. Your expectations faded, your questions disappeared, your awareness slowed. Your need for movement began to loosen, and at first, that felt like understanding, like you were beginning to grasp how this place worked. But then something shifted again, not in the environment, in perspective. I remember looking out at the ocean floor once more. The same surface, the same stillness, the same unchanging presence. And suddenly, it didn't feel unfamiliar anymore. It didn't feel strange. It didn't feel difficult to understand. It felt normal. And that was when the realization appeared. Nothing here had changed. Not the environment, not the creatures, not the silence. Everything was exactly as it had been from the moment we arrived. The only difference was me. I had changed the way I observed, the way I thought, the way I expected things to behave. All of it had shifted quietly, without resistance, without effort. And because of that, this place no longer felt unnatural. It felt consistent, complete, as if it had always made sense, and I had simply taken time to align with it. I remember becoming aware of something subtle. The discomfort was gone, not reduced, gone. Fine, not because the environment became easier, but because I had stopped expecting it to be different. And in that absence of expectation, everything felt stable, even my own thoughts. They no longer tried to move forward. They no longer tried to interpret. They simply remained, just like everything else. That was when the final shift settled. This place did not change me. It did not act on me. It did not influence me in any active way. It simply existed, and in that existence, I adapted. Not because I needed to survive, but because there was no alternative. Because in a place where nothing changes, the only thing that can adjust is the one thing that still can. And that thing was me. I remember trying to recall how I had felt when we first arrived. The curiosity, the expectation, the need to understand. And it felt distant, not in time, but in structure, because those ways of thinking no longer fit here. They belonged to a world where things move, where things change, where things become something else. But here, none of that exists. And so those patterns had faded, not erased, just no longer active. I remember sitting there, aware of everything, and yet not seeking anything, not expecting anything, not needing anything to happen. And in that stillness, something became undeniable. This place does not transform what enters it. It reveals what cannot remain unchanged, and what cannot remain unchanged adjusts until it matches, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to exist here without resistance. I remember looking one last time before we began to rise. The same surface, the same presence, the same endless stillness. And for the first time, it didn't feel distant. It didn't feel separate. It didn't feel like something I was observing. It felt like something I had briefly become part of, not physically, but structurally, in the way I perceived, in the way I experienced, in the way I no longer expected change. And that was when the final realization settled. This place does not change. It never did. It never needed to, and it never will. The only thing that changes is whatever enters it and stays long enough to understand. The decision to rise. It didn't feel like a decision. There was no moment where someone said, "We should go." No urgency, no signal, no reason that stood out. And yet, at some point, we began to rise. Not quickly, not even noticeably, just slowly, so slowly that at first it didn't feel like movement at all. I remember looking at the ocean floor, expecting something to change, a shift in distance, a difference in perspective, some indication that we were no longer where we had been. But nothing changed. The surface remained the same. The stillness remained complete. The creatures, if they were still there, did not appear different. And that was when the first uncertainty appeared. Are we moving, or just thinking that we are? The thought didn't come from doubt. It came from absence, because movement usually creates difference. You move and something changes. Distance increases. Perspective shifts. But here, there was no difference. Nothing to compare, nothing to confirm that anything had happened. I remember checking the instruments again. Numbers were changing. Depth, pressure, time. Fewer, all of them indicating that we were rising. But those numbers felt disconnected. They described something, but they didn't match what I was experiencing, because experience remained the same. The ocean floor did not recede. The darkness did not shift. The silence did not change. Everything remained exactly as it had been. And that was when the tension returned, not as fear, but as uncertainty. Because if movement produces no change, then what does movement actually mean? A vessel continued, or at least it was supposed to, but there was no sensation of departure, no feeling of leaving something behind, no sense that we were going anywhere at all, only the same presence continuing around us. I remember trying to focus on a point again to see if it would shift, if it would move away, but it didn't. Not slowly, not subtly, not at all. And that was when the idea formed. What if this place cannot be left in the way we expect? Not physically, but perceptually, because leaving requires change. It requires a transition from one state to another. But here, there is only one state, unchanging, continuous, complete. And within that state, movement does not create difference. It only continues within the same condition. I remember becoming aware of something else, the way I was interpreting the experience. At first, I had expected a clear separation, a moment where the ocean floor would begin to disappear, where the environment would shift, where I would feel that we were no longer there. But that moment never came, because nothing here marked marks transitions. Nothing signals change. Nothing defines a boundary between before and after. Everything simply remains. And that was when the realization began to settle. We are not leaving this place. We are simply no longer staying. And those are not the same thing, because leaving implies distance. It implies separation. It implies that something becomes something else. But here, nothing becomes anything else. It only continues in the same way, without variation, without distinction. I remember one final thought as we continued to rise. Not a question, not a conclusion, just a quiet recognition. This place does not hold you. It does not keep you. It does not prevent you from leaving, but it also does not acknowledge that you ever arrive. And because of that, it does not recognize that you are going. When distance stops meaning anything, at first, I tried to measure it, not with instruments, with perception. The way you normally understand movement. You move upward and the surface below you becomes smaller. You move away and things begin to fade. Distance creates difference. That's how we know it exists. But here, there was no difference. I remember looking down again, expecting the ocean floor to feel further away, less defined, less present. But it didn't. It looked the same, not similar, not close enough to confuse. Exactly the same, as if nothing had changed between us at all. The idea didn't make sense at first, because distance is not something we question. It's constant, reliable, predictable. You move, and the relationship between you and everything else changes. But here, that relationship remained fixed, unaltered. I remember trying to focus on the edge of the visible surface, trying to detect even the smallest shift, a change in scale, a change in clarity. But there was nothing, no transition, no gradual fading, no indication that we were moving away. And that was when the uncertainty deepened. If distance is increasing, why does nothing feel further? The vessel continued to rise, or at least that's what the instruments suggested. But experience remained unchanged. The ocean floor was still there, present, unmoved, unaffected by the supposed separation between us. And slowly, a different understanding began to form. Distance is only meaningful when something changes because of it, when objects become smaller, when details disappear, when perspective shifts. But here, none of that was happening, which meant distance was no longer doing anything. It existed, but it had no effect. And something that exists without effect begins to lose its meaning. I remember trying to think about it differently, trying to understand it in terms of scale. Maybe the distance was too large. Maybe the changes were too subtle. But even that explanation required variation, and there was none. Everything remained consistent, not just visually. Conceptually, the ocean floor did not recede. It did not become less present. It did not feel like something we were leaving behind. It felt like something that continued exactly as it was, regardless of where we were. And that was when the realization shifted again. We were not moving away from it. We were simply no longer aligned with it, not physically, but perceptually, because if distance had meaning, we would feel it, we would see it, we would experience it. But here, there was nothing to experience, only the same presence, extending without change. I remember noticing something else. The sense of direction was beginning to fade, not completely, but enough to feel unstable. Up and down still existed in theory, but they no longer felt different, because difference depends on change, and here there was none. Rising did not feel like rising. It felt like continuation, just like everything else. The same condition, repeating without variation. And within that repetition, direction becomes irrelevant, because direction implies movement towards something different. But when everything remains the same, there is no toward, only within. I remember trying to imagine how far we had gone, trying to picture the distance between us and the ocean floor. But the image wouldn't form, because distance requires contrast, and there was no contrast to work with. Everything was equally present, equally unchanged, equally near. And that was when the final thought settled. Distance still exists here, but it no longer matters, because nothing changes because of it. And when nothing changes, separation becomes an idea, not an experience. The ocean floor was not beneath us, not in the way I understood. It was simply there, as it had always been, as it would always be, unaffected by how far we thought we had moved. And in that realization, something else became clear. We were not getting further away. We were just no longer able to recognize how close we still were. When the surface begins to feel unreal. At first, I thought we were returning to something familiar, that eventually the surface would feel like home again. That light would reappear, that movement would return, that everything would begin to behave the way it always had. But as we continued to rise, something felt off. Not in the environment, in the way I was expecting it to be, because expectation had changed without me noticing. I remember trying to imagine the surface, the way light reflects on water, the way waves move, the way the world feels active. But the image felt distant, not far away in space, but far away in structure, as if it belonged to a different kind of reality. Because down here, nothing moved, nothing shifted, nothing reacted. And slowly, that became the reference point. Stillness became normal. Continuity became expected. And anything outside of that began to feel unfamiliar. I remember noticing the first hint of change. A slight difference in the darkness, not brighter, just less complete. But instead of feeling relief, it felt wrong, not threatening, just inconsistent. Because after so long, the absence of change had become stable, reliable, predictable. And now something was interrupting that. I remember focusing on it, trying to understand what I was seeing, but my perception didn't adjust immediately, because it had already adapted to something else, to a world where nothing shifts. And now, even the smallest variation felt exaggerated, unnatural, almost artificial. I remember thinking something quietly. The surface might not feel real anymore. The thought didn't come from doubt. It came from contrast, because reality, as we experience it, is built on change, movement, difference, transition. But after existing in a place where none of those things occur, those same qualities begin to feel unfamiliar. I remember trying to imagine movement again, not just visually, but conceptually. Something happening, something becoming. But the idea felt unstable, because movement now seemed unnecessary, even excessive, as if it belonged to a world that required constant adjustment just to exist. And compared to what I had just experienced, that felt incomplete. I remember noticing another shift. The darkness began to separate, not fully, but enough to suggest depth, variation. And instead of clarity, it created uncertainty, because variation implies difference, and difference implies change, and change no longer felt natural. I remember becoming aware of my own reaction, not fear, not confusion, just hesitation, a quiet resistance to something that should have felt familiar, because familiarity had changed without me realizing it. The longer we had stayed below, the more my perception had aligned with it, with stillness, with continuity, with the absence of change. And now, as those conditions began to disappear, it felt like something was being disrupted, not the environment, but the stability I had adapted to. I remember thinking again about the surface, what it would feel like, what it would look like. But the more I imagined it, the less real it seemed. Not because it wasn't real, but because it no longer matched the way I was perceiving the world. Because up there, things never stopped changing. Light shifts, water moves, air flows. Everything is in motion constantly. And now that felt excessive, unnecessary, even chaotic compared to the stillness below. I remember noticing the first real change in light, a faint presence, something that didn't belong to darkness. And instead of relief, there was a moment of disconnection, because light implies change. It creates contrast. It reveals difference, and difference was something I had stopped expecting. I remember looking around as the environment slowly began to shift. Shapes became less uniform. The darkness became less complete, and yet it didn't feel like we were returning to reality. It felt like we were entering something else, something unstable, something constantly changing, something that never remains the same. And that instability felt unfamiliar, because for the first time, change itself felt unnatural. I remember one quiet realization as the surface drew closer. Not a thought, not a conclusion, just something that became clear. The world above is defined by change. But after existing in a place where nothing ever changes, that definition begins to feel uncertain, because once you experience stillness, absolute stillness, everything that moves begins to feel different, not wrong, but less complete. And that is when the shift becomes undeniable. You are not returning to the same world, because the way you perceive it has already changed. When you realize you never really left, at some point the light returned, not suddenly, not in a way that felt dramatic, just gradually, a soft presence that began to replace the darkness, and with it came everything I had expected. Variation, movement, subtle changes in the water, a sense that the environment was responding again. By all measures, we had returned. The surface was above. The world I knew was close, and yet something didn't align, not in what I saw, but in what I felt. Because the return did not feel like a return. There was no sense of crossing a boundary, no moment where one state ended and another began, only a continuation that had never truly stopped. I remember looking upward toward the light. It was real, it was there, and yet it felt distant, not in space, but in meaning, because meaning had changed. The light did not feel like something new. It felt like something added, something layered on top of a condition that had never disappeared. I remember noticing the movement again, the water shifting, particles drifting, subtle changes in direction, and for a moment it felt unfamiliar, because movement was no longer the default. Stillness was, and now everything that moved felt like an interruption, not wrong, just secondary. I remember becoming aware of something deeper. The ocean floor had not faded from perception. It was still there, not visually, but structurally, in the way I understood everything around me, in the way I interpreted stillness, in the way I no longer expected change. And that was when the realization settled. We had not left that place, not completely, because leaving implies separation. It implies that something becomes distant, that something is no longer part of your experience. But this was different. The environment had changed, but the condition had not. It remained quietly beneath everything else. I remember looking around again at the light, at the movement, at the subtle shifts in the water, and for the first time, it felt like I was seeing two things at once: the world above and something deeper, something unchanged, something that did not move even as everything else did. And that deeper presence felt more stable, more complete, more real, not because it was visible, but because it did not depend on anything. It did not require light. It did not require movement. It did not require change. It simply was, and that was remained, even as everything else returned. I remember thinking something quietly. The surface feels like variation, but the deep feels like truth, not a conclusion, not something I believe, just something that felt undeniable. Because once you experience a place, that does not change. Everything that does begins to feel conditional, temporary, dependent on something else, and that dependency becomes visible. I remember noticing how quickly things shifted above. Light moving, water changing, everything in motion, constantly adjusting, and for the first time that felt unstable, not dangerous, but incomplete, because it required effort, it required continuation, it required something to keep happening. But the deep required nothing. It remained the same without needing to. And that difference changes how you see everything. I remember one final realization as we fully returned. Not something I searched for, something that appeared on its own. We did not leave that place. We only moved to a part of the ocean where change is visible again. But beneath that visibility, the same condition remains, unchanged, unmoved, unaware. And now I can still feel it, not as a memory, but as a reference, a quiet understanding that exists beneath everything else, that no matter how much the world moves, there is something deeper that never does. And once you know that, you don't return to the surface the same way again. What remains after you return? It didn't end when we surfaced. There was no clear moment where everything became normal again. No instant where the world above felt fully familiar. By all appearances, we had returned. The light was back. The movement was everywhere. The subtle variations in water, in sound, in space, all of it had resumed. And yet, something remained. Not in the environment, inside perception. I remember standing there, aware of everything around me and noticing something unusual. Nothing felt entirely new, not because I had seen it before, but because I had experienced something deeper, something that did not depend on any of this. The movement above felt real, but it also felt temporary, not fragile, just conditional, as if everything here required something else to continue. Light needed space, motion needed difference, time needed change. change. And once you've been in a place when none of those things are required, you begin to see them differently. I remember watching the surface of the water, the way it shifted constantly, the way nothing held its form. And for the first time, it didn't feel stable, not unstable in a dangerous way, but in a way that made you aware that it could always become something else. And that awareness stays with you, not as a thought, but as a quiet reference. Because beneath all of this, there is something that does not change, something that does not move, something that does not depend on anything to remain exactly as it is. And once you've seen it, you don't forget, not because it was dramatic, but because it was complete, and completeness has a way of staying. The memory that doesn't feel like memory. At first, I thought it would fade, like most experiences do. Something distant, something that becomes less clear over time. But this was different. It didn't fade, it didn't blur, it didn't become something I remembered. It became something I continued to feel, not constantly, not in a way that interrupted anything, just quietly present, like something beneath everything else. I remember trying to describe it once, not in detail, just the feeling of it, but the words didn't fit because it wasn't something that had happened. It wasn't a sequence. It wasn't an event. It was a condition, and conditions don't pass. They remain even when everything around them changes. I remember moments when everything felt normal again. Conversations, movement, the rhythm of everyday life. And yet, in the background, there was always something else. A quiet stillness, not visible, not audible, but present, as if a part of perception had been adjusted and could not return to the way it was before. Because once you experience a place without change, change itself becomes noticeable, not overwhelming, just constant. And that constancy creates contrast, a contrast that never fully disappears. The way you begin to notice change. After a while, you begin to see it everywhere, not the deep, but its absence, in movement, in time, in the way things shift and respond. Everything becomes more visible because everything is changing all the time. I remember watching something simple, light moving across a surface, the way it never stayed in one place, the way it was always becoming something else. And for the first time, I noticed how much effort that required. Not effort in action, but in structure, because change is constant work. It requires continuation. It requires sequence. It requires something to keep happening. And once you've seen a place when none of that exists, you begin to understand something subtle. Change is not the default. It is a condition, one that we are used to, one that feels normal, but one that is not absolute. I remember realizing that this awareness was not something I had learned. It was something I had experienced, and experience does not disappear the way ideas do. It stays quietly in the background, shaping the way everything else is seen. The part that never leaves. In the end, there was no conclusion, no final understanding, no clear explanation that made everything complete. And that felt right, because the place itself did not offer explanations. It did not provide answers. It did not change to reveal anything. It simply existed, and that existence was enough. I remember thinking much later, not about what we had seen, but about what had remained. Not be images, not the depth, not the distance, but the condition, that quiet, unmoving presence that does not depend on anything else, and the realization that it is still there, not just in the ocean, but beneath everything, unchanged, unmoving, unaffected, and now even here, surrounded by movement, by light, by time, I can still feel it. Not strongly, not in a way that interrupts anything, just quietly, like something that does not need to be noticed to exist. And that is what stays. Not the journey, not the descent, not the return, but the understanding that beneath everything that changes, there is something that never does. And once you know that, you carry it with you, not as a memory, but as something that never needed to begin and will never need to end.